All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are going to get this show on the road. Thank you all for being here. My name is Helen Schroeder. I'm the marketing coordinator for Sigma Assessment Systems, and I will be your co-host for the webinar today. Here presenting, we have my colleague Shruti Kumar. And for those of you who are new to Sigma, we just wanted to take a moment to introduce the organization. Sigma is a professional services firm that offers talent development, succession planning, and psychological assessments for organizations who are looking to build their internal talent pools. We've been in business for over 50 years, and so as a company, we have quite a bit of experience, and we're thrilled to be here today to speak with you about succession planning, particularly in the context of small and medium enterprises. So we have about 60 minutes together today. For the first 45 minutes or so, Shruti will walk you through the webinar content to introduce you to a 6-step succession planning process and how it can be adapted to meet the unique needs of SMEs. We will be recording the session, so no need to take notes. We'll share both a recording and a copy of the slides following the session. And we will also leave 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to cover any questions that you have. So feel free to use the Q&A box as we go throughout the webinar. I'll be monitoring that. And if there's anything that we don't get to in our time together today, we can absolutely follow up via email. But for now, use that Q&A, don't be shy. And without any further ado, I will introduce you to Shruti. Shruti has a master's in industrial organizational psychology from Western University. As a member of our consulting team, she applies her passion and expertise to create evidence-based content on organizational best practices. Shruti largely develops resources and facilitates presentations designed to support leadership development and succession planning. So we have an expert here with us today. Through this work, Shruti's main goal is to help clients gain knowledge, feel more confident, and achieve success in their workplaces. So I'll pass it off to Shruti now to get started.
Thank you, Helen, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar. So if you're familiar with our webinars, you may know that we like to use polls to get audience engagement throughout. So we use something called Mentimeter. And so you'll see that QR code on the screen. And if you're wondering what that is, that basically provides you access to the polls. So if you'd like, you can grab your phone and scan that QR code, and that will link you to the polls that we'll be using throughout the session. If you would prefer, Helen will also be dropping down in the chat the manual way to log into the polls. So you can go to menti.com and you can use the code 35399298. And if the QR code isn't working for you and you missed that code, no worries. We'll pop that on again on the screen once we get to the polls. All right, so we're going to be covering a few different things today. So we'll start out by learning more about the basics of succession planning. So what it is, how it's different from something called replacement hiring, and why succession planning is important for small and medium enterprises. So we'll also go through Sigma's 6-step succession planning process, which will give you a better sense of how to implement succession planning within your own organization. Now, there are also a few key succession planning obstacles that are unique to small and medium enterprises. So we'll talk more about what those challenges are and how you can navigate them. So let's dive in. Now, let's make sure that we're actually on the same page when we talk about what succession planning is. So it's not just about having a list of candidates who might one day replace more senior employees. Instead, we can think of succession planning as a process for identifying and developing individuals in your organization. So individuals who have the potential to fill those key roles in your organization when the employees who are currently in those roles are promoted or if they perhaps leave your company. So this is a strategic planning process. It focuses on building up internal talent before any vacancies arise. So succession planning really encourages us to think about what's next and to take proactive steps to set your organization up for long-term success. So this involves identifying the roles that may need to be filled in the future, considering the skill gaps of existing employees, and providing them with opportunities for development and growth. So, with that brief introduction to succession planning, I would love to hear from the audience at this point. So, I'm just going to start this poll. So, it looks like we got a few answers trickling in already, which is wonderful. So, if you access the poll using the QR code, you'll see this question and you can submit your response. Otherwise, you can use menti.com and the code that you see at the top of the screen, and which I believe Helen has also popped onto the chat. Now, once you answer the question, you can hit submit. And if you're not actually seeing this question, just refresh your screen and it should come up. So does your company have a succession plan? So it seems like so far, everyone who's answered does have a formal plan in place that's used across the organization. And this is great to hear, right? Because not all organizations do have that plan in place or have formalized the plan. So I'll give it about 20 or 30 more seconds if anyone else would like to answer. Pardon me, I'm just looking over at my second monitor here. All right, well, we'll have more opportunities for audience engagement. Thank you to those who did answer so far. And it's great to hear that, that you have this formal plan in place. Now, I do want to quickly note that while many organizations think they are engaged in a succession planning process, when we learn a little bit more about what they're doing, so when we ask questions about their plan or when they come to us for support, we quickly realize that what they're engaged in is something a little bit different than succession planning. So this is actually called replacement hiring. So I want to break down the difference between the two approaches so you can think more about what your organization might be engaged in. So replacement hiring is a process that's done on an as-needed basis. So it tends to be reactive. You realize that a vacancy has come up, and you scramble to recruit and interview and train a new candidate. This process often involves trying to find someone who's a carbon copy of the previous job holder. And it's often up to the supervisor or even someone from HR to make that comparison. Because often someone will submit their 2 weeks notice and then the organization realizes, hey, we need to fill this position. So sometimes you don't even get feedback from the current job holder. And when you are urgently trying to find a replacement, you tend to lose a little bit of objectivity in that process because you have to rely on whoever happens to be in the job market at that time. So there's a little bit of that sense of being in the right place at the right time. Now, in contrast to replacement hiring, succession planning is a long-term strategic commitment to both your organization as well as to your current employees. So it's not a process that's meant only for the HR department to handle. It typically involves buy-in from your organization's senior leadership team. So the focus here is preparing your best candidate for a role. And so this involves identifying skill gaps and developing competencies before they are even needed. So succession planning often tends to incorporate information from multiple sources. So this can include direct reports, colleagues, supervisors, as well as other leaders. And this really helps to ensure that you're supporting your employees, but also targeting your organization's long-term goals. So overall, instead of hiring someone who's the best candidate available at the time, you're actually basing your internal promotions on a more objective process. Now, of course, there might be occasions when you do need to hire from outside the organization, especially as a small to medium enterprise. But when you do have a succession plan in place, that hiring from outside of the organization is integrated with your other strategic initiatives. So, overall, succession planning is a powerful tool that ensures the long term success of your organization. And this is especially true for small to medium enterprises because those vacancies can really have a great impact on your business operations. So, overall, with succession planning, you're taking a strategic and intentional approach, and you're preparing your best internal candidates for a role before they're needed. And this really helps to ensure a seamless role transition. There are many benefits to this approach. So, by developing that plan, you're gaining a roadmap for continuity, which improves your organization's resiliency during times of change. You're also building a pool of qualified candidates for those critical roles. And this really helps in minimizing any gaps in knowledge and avoiding any other negative impact of vacancies. It also increases your employees' confidence in your organization's ability to fill those vacant roles. With succession planning, you're also providing employees with opportunities for growth and development, which helps to motivate them and inspires a sense of job security and work engagement. I do want to note also that although succession plans are especially important for smaller and medium enterprises, less than 50% of these organizations actually have one in place. And more than that, only about 10% of organizations have a plan that's formal and documented. So, even for a smaller organization, creating a structured plan is important in reducing ambiguity, which then helps to improve communication and further ensures accountability during implementation. So, let's talk more about how to develop this formal plan. Oh, and I do want to note some of the unique considerations that we will be talking more about for your small to medium enterprise. So while the overall process of session planning will look similar for most organizations, we do recognize that there are some unique challenges. So one of these includes greater role complexity for small to medium enterprises. So, by virtue of having a smaller team, your employees tend to take on many different responsibilities, and they also accumulate deep organizational knowledge. So, your organization likely has employees who are really good at their jobs because they've played a role in personalizing it to themselves. But then that makes it trickier to replace them if they have to move on. Having that smaller internal talent pool also makes it challenging to develop your talent and only promote internally. So, although we do advocate for that robust succession process, we acknowledge that there may be times where you do have to hire externally. So, we do have some tips for how that external hiring can be integrated as part of your overall plan. Now, of course, no matter the size of your organization, you'll likely have to navigate certain budget and resource limitations. However, with small to medium enterprises, there are some unique considerations as well. So we'll cover each of these challenges in more depth. But before we do so, I'd like to just briefly go over Sigma's six-step succession process. Once we've understood the foundation of the overall process, we can talk more about how to adapt this process to the needs of your specific organization. So the stages involved in Sigma's process include identifying critical roles, building success profiles, nominating successors, assessing their skill gaps, developing their potential, and measuring progress over time. So this six-step process has been used in a variety of organizations across a range of industries, and it's valuable no matter the size of your organization. So by building in the structure, we've really streamlined the work that you need to do in order to create your overall plan. we know that succession planning can be overwhelming and time consuming. And so this process is really designed to save you a lot of time and effort. So you can see on the right-hand side in the green text, we've provided many free resources that can help you to clearly understand and work through each of these stages. So these resources are a part of our free template library. So you can head over to our website and you can take a look at the worksheets and templates that we offer. So let's go through each of these stages one at a time. All right, so this first step is to identify the critical positions that you would include in your plan. So this stage might seem relatively straightforward, but there are many factors to consider. And it's really important to take the time to do this well because it lays the foundation for your overall plan. So I want to spend a little bit more time reviewing this initial step, and we can be a bit briefer in the following. So critical roles are those that have the greatest impact on your organization's performance. So generally, people automatically think of executive, management, and other leadership positions. But you don't want to focus exclusively on the roles that are at the top of the hierarchy, as it's very likely that you have critical roles throughout the organization. So this can be your administrative staff or your IT staff. So really think about who has that unique knowledge or that unique skill set who would be really difficult to replace without that careful, proactive planning. Now, there are two concepts to consider here. The first is critical people, and then there's critical roles. So you can start by considering those critical people in your organization. So these are those employees who wear multiple hats and they take on many important responsibilities. Now, there is a difference between those critical people and those critical roles, but in smaller organizations, these concepts can become a little bit conflated. So you might identify a role as a critical position because the current employee in that role is just so valuable to your organization. Now, these critical people can absolutely help you in guiding you in identifying those critical roles. But you want to keep in mind that the purpose of succession planning is preparing individuals for stepping into positions rather than trying to find a cookie cutter replacement of the current incumbent. I also want to note here that when we're looking at the bigger picture of succession planning, it can be really challenging to create that leadership pipeline for those critical superheroes who really just do it all. So if you have these types of employees in your organization, this could actually be a sign that that one role needs to be broken down into two or even more distinct critical positions. This will really help you in creating a clear succession plan, but it will also benefit your organization in avoiding a catastrophic loss of talent if your superhero employee becomes burnt out or if they decide to move on. Now, once you've decided on the roles that are critical for your organization, you would prioritize them in your organization's succession plan. And this will help you to take a more manageable and realistic approach to the rest of the process. So the second step is to build success profiles. So in this stage, the goal is to describe the competencies that are necessary to perform each critical role. So once you've selected the critical roles, you would create one profile for each of the roles. Now, when we're thinking about the behaviors and the skills that are important for these roles, we can consider a few different factors. So first, think about those competencies that are relevant for the role itself. So if you have a sales manager in your organization, perhaps client and customer relations is a key competency for their current role. You can also think about that role in the future. So perhaps the incumbent realizes that attracting staff is a future competency that's important for their role, given the expansion of their department. So you're thinking about the role at present as well as in the future. You can also consider the competencies that are relevant for general leadership in your organization. And again, this is both in the present as well as in the near future, according to your organization's evolving needs. So I encourage you to work with both the incumbent as well as your leadership team to identify what these relevant competencies are. Now, in this next stage, you'll consider potential candidates for each critical role and nominate successors for them. So we're not looking for just a single individual to replace the current employee in that role. What we're actually encouraging is that organizations identify and build an entire leadership pipeline. So if you've identified a director position as a critical role, you might have one candidate who is currently a mid-level manager who can be ready for that role within the next year or so. But you can also find different potential candidates who are perhaps in more junior positions who could be ready within 3 to 5 years. So you want to identify those short and those long-term candidates and include all of them in your plan. So identifying these individuals is important for all organizations, but it's also especially relevant for smaller businesses. When you're creating your plan, you might realize that a single employee is being considered for multiple higher level critical roles. But of course, a single person cannot fulfill multiple roles. So this can really help your organization identify where more talent is needed and who you might want to target for long-term development. All right, so once you've identified the necessary competencies for the critical roles and you've nominated successors, you can move on to this fourth stage. And so at this point, you can assess the development needs for each candidate by identifying gaps between their current skills and the competencies that they need for the current role, for the next role. So by identifying those skill gaps, you can begin to consider how to prioritize opportunities for growth and development. It's also really helpful to have that baseline measure of their skills in order to evaluate the efficacy of your succession program. Now, when you're assessing development needs, it's really critical that you use scientifically validated assessments that measure the skills that are relevant to the succession position. So this ensures that you're gaining an accurate understanding of your employees' development areas so that you can appropriately help them to build their skills. Now, this leads into the fifth stage, which is where you develop your talent. So the previous stages were all leading up to this point, and this is where you get that payoff of all that preliminary work. So here, you're creating development plans for your succession candidates, and you're providing them with coaching and training opportunities to guide their skill attainment and to build them into capable leaders. Now, I want to remind you that obstacles and challenges are expected parts of this development journey. So at this stage, this is where internal or external coaches can be a great asset to the succession process because they can really help in keeping your employees motivated in the face of those unexpected disruptions. And also keep in mind that you're developing a leadership pipeline. So different candidates may have different timelines for their development. Now, we don't just end it there. We also have this last component of the process, which is to measure progress. So this involves quantifying success and tracking candidate growth. Now, this is a great opportunity to reflect on the progress made and to address any remaining skill gaps. It can be really tempting to skip over this stage, but it's really valuable in ensuring that your succession plan is having the intended impact. So common metrics that you might consider include things like turnover rates, percentage of roles that are filled internally, and also things like employee engagement and their satisfaction with the succession program. All right, so this is what the succession process looks like overall. And it's important to understand the fundamentals of this because it is generally the same for all organizations. We do really stand by this process. However, as we've mentioned, there are definitely some key considerations that you want to keep in mind when we're talking specifically about small to medium enterprises. So at this point, we can dive into what those are. All right, so the first consideration is that your small or medium-sized business likely has fewer but more complex roles. So you may have employees who are wearing lots of different hats, and this can make it really difficult to know what their core job description actually is. So what that core role really entails and what those competencies are that you need to address in the overall program. Now, related to this first consideration is that you're likely going to have employees with unique expertise and deep pools of knowledge. So the challenge here is to ensure that you're not losing out on any of the key knowledge that employees have when they move on. And now, by virtue of being a smaller company, you also have that smaller internal candidate pool. So this means that internal succession is not always possible, and that's okay. But that external hiring can still occur in the context of a succession plan. Now, your small to medium sized business might also have budget or other resource related concerns. So let's actually go through each of these considerations in depth. All right, so the smaller your organization, the more likely that roles will be complex and fluid. So often, single employees take on multiple responsibilities. They might start out sticking really closely to their job description, but over time, they accumulate a lot of knowledge and take on a lot of different roles. So this can make it really hard to define and to identify what that critical position actually is. And remember, that's the very first step in the overall succession process. So right away, you might be facing a hurdle. Now, our recommended solution is to start by mapping out your organizational chart. And if you already have one in place, there are also further details that you might want to consider adding to it. So by mapping out this organizational hierarchy or just the general layout of your business, you can clearly visualize the pipeline and how each role relates to one another. And doing this step can really help to reduce that sense of overwhelm. Now, even if your organizational structure is relatively flat, or even if roles are not clearly defined, this first step can be a valuable process for better understanding the connections between each roles. Now, you can also note different details and complexities that are related to those roles. So consider how important is how important is that role for your overall organizational functioning? Is the current employee in that role close to retirement? In contrast, are they perhaps a newer employee who has really shared their interest for leadership development? You can even think about how this role might change in the future if your organization is currently evolving. So start by mapping out this organizational chart. And if you do engage in Sigma's six-step succession process, we also have templates that can help you really narrow down those critical roles. But the first step is to understand your overall organizational mapping. Now, this next challenge is all about that valuable knowledge that I keep talking about. So, as we know, roles can be more complex and fluid in those smaller businesses. And so the knowledge that employees gain can be quite deep, especially if they have a lot of autonomy in their roles or if they've taken on a lot of different responsibilities. So if you lose that talent, if you lose that individual, this means a loss of knowledge, unless you've already established a knowledge sharing process. So to minimize any negative impact of vacancies, you want to ensure that you're able to preserve knowledge and pass it along to succession candidates. And so we really advocate for establishing a culture of knowledge transfer. So, in the context of succession planning, knowledge transfer means passing down of that organizational or technical knowledge from the current job holder to their successor. So, this can include critical information about the role itself, key relationships within the organization, or key notes on the priorities or current projects. This can also involve the technical knowledge that's required to perform the role. So perhaps if a specific role requires a certain software, this involves that technical knowledge as well. Now, to ensure that knowledge transfer is comprehensive, we really need to think carefully. Sorry, I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. So, when we're thinking about this organizational knowledge, we really want to think carefully about the different levels of knowledge. So you can think about knowledge at work as an iceberg. Now, above the water, you have what we call explicit knowledge. So these are things like documents, records, how-to guides, the tasks that are associated with different roles. Now, even though this is labeled as explicit knowledge, this doesn't mean that every organization has done a good job of making this information clear and accessible, or even ensuring that this information is recorded. Now, with this iceberg analogy, we also have what's called tacit knowledge. So the knowledge that's kind of hidden below the water. So this type of knowledge is often gained through learned experience or trial and error, such as history with vendors or even others in other departments. Now, sometimes there is a mismatch between that explicit and tacit knowledge. So the how-to guide might say things are done in a certain way, but trial and error have shown a better method. So while the current job holder possesses this tacit knowledge, there needs to be a system in place to ensure that this information is preserved, but also shared with other employees. So establishing this system for knowledge preservation is incredibly valuable when your organization is in the process of preparing succession candidates. So how do you actually create this system? Now, this is actually a multi-step process. So just like succession planning, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. Now, the first step is to assess the knowledge that needs to be transferred. So identify the knowledge. Be really thorough in this step and think both about explicit knowledge as well as tacit knowledge. Next, you can prioritize this knowledge. So consider what information will have the largest impact if it's lost. What will severely inhibit your organization's efficiency and productivity? Then, depending on the depth of this information, you can determine how to best capture and transfer that knowledge. So, creating or adding to those organizational records, maybe even creating databases for your employees. And finally, you want to share and store that knowledge. So make sure that your employees are aware that it actually exists and that they're able to access it. And actively encourage knowledge sharing. So encourage your employees to record and update any records or documents over time. Now, as I've mentioned, knowledge transfer is a valuable asset for succession planning, but you can also think about how it would benefit your organization in other ways as well, because it really reduces unnecessary time and friction in relearning the best way to do things. Now, moving on to the third challenge, this has to do with the large impact of vacancies on small to medium enterprises. So this can really disrupt your day-to-day operations, which is why we really advocate for that internal planning process. Of course, if the internal talent pool is small to begin with, it can be really challenging to rely on that internal talent. So we've seen organizations that have departments of only one or two people. So it's not always possible to build a pipeline. So for smaller organizations, we really recommend that you use a combination of internal and external talent to fill your critical roles. And to ensure that you're prepared for any sudden personnel changes, because we can't always anticipate them, you need to identify in advance which roles can be filled internally and which require external candidates. So this is actually different from replacement hiring, where you're reactively filling vacancies. Instead, we advocate for a more strategic process. So we do have some guidance on when you should consider that internal promotion and when you might want to do some external hiring. So the first factor to consider is when that position requires highly specialized knowledge that's very specific to your organization. So ideally, you want to start building that leadership pipeline and identifying those short-term and those long-term succession candidates who can eventually fill that role. Now, sometimes we've tried our best to do this, but we're unsuccessful. Perhaps there is no direct report or there is no other employee from a different department who can one day fill that role. So this is why it's actually quite important to have that knowledge sharing system in place. So if you do have to hire externally for a role with very specialized knowledge, the new employee won't have to jump into the deep end without any guidance. Now, with that said, you might want to prioritize hiring externally when the role requires skills that are not based on unique organizational knowledge. So external hires often work best for entry-level roles, where new workers often have transferable skills that they can easily apply to your organization, and so they don't need to rely on that deep pool of knowledge to quickly excel in their role. We can also consider your current talent pool. So we recommend that you do consider promoting internally when you have an internal candidate who's motivated to take on their next role, who's extensively prepared for and participated in talent development, and who's really demonstrated that they are a capable candidate. So if your organization has invested in that employee and that employee in turn has shown their commitment and their potential, you don't want to disregard them. Now, on the other hand, there may be periods where your organization needs access to a larger talent pool with a more diverse skill set, and this is something that doesn't already exist in your company. So, in that case, you might want to consider hiring externally. But again, we recommend that you be quite strategic about this. But of course, if it's a necessity, it's something that you can move forward with. Now, finally, we can think about your organizational needs. So if your current operations are quite stable and you really want to maintain that consistent functioning, you may want to consider promoting internally if those candidates are available. Now, in cases when your organization is preparing for a major change, these are the times where you might want to consider bringing in a fresh perspective. So these external candidates come with their own knowledge base and their own diverse experiences that can actually serve to really strengthen your organization. So these are just a few factors to consider. Um, Overall, what we really recommend is that you be quite strategic about this and be proactive about thinking in advance. All right, so this brings us to the last challenge, which is based in budget and other resource limitations. So due to these factors, you may have constraints in your ability to implement that formal training or that formal development plan. So it's not just about the budget. You might simply not have enough employees who are available to coach or to mentor more junior employees. Or there may simply be challenges in dedicating employee time to training. So we do recognize that traditional training programs may not work for your small to medium enterprise. Excuse me, just one moment. My apologies. So, with all of that said, there are ways to navigate these development barriers. So, what we recommend is to use a variety of tools to provide opportunities for growth for your current employees. So, many small to medium enterprises that need to train succession candidates can rely on informal knowledge sharing and on the job training. You can also encourage your employees to share specialized knowledge with direct reports proactively over time, so they're not scrambling to fill in those gaps when those junior employees become succession candidates. Now, you might also consider encouraging employees to pursue self guided learning. So they can self direct their own skill development to become more qualified future candidates. However, we do recommend that you support them in this process by providing access to leadership assessments. And these can be a really helpful tool in guiding independent development. So, leadership assessments really help to increase employees' self awareness about their strengths as well as their development opportunities. So, one of the many assessments that we offer is our Leadership Skills Profile Revised, so the LSPR. Now, the LSPR uses an evidence based model of personality to assess 50 leadership traits that are relevant to any job. And this is something that has shown strong predictive validity and reliability. So, this is our flagship leadership assessment, and it has a lot of benefits for organizations. And this is especially the case if you don't have a lot of internal coaches or other resources to help support leadership development. I'm so sorry. I think there's just something caught in my throat. Give me one moment, please. All right, so where was I? All right, so as I mentioned, the LSPR is our flagship leadership assessment. And so this is something that we really feel strongly about. So once employees complete the LSPR, they automatically receive a focus report. And so this provides an analysis of their results and recommendations for self-development. So employees will see a summary of their scores on all 50 of those leadership competencies. They'll also see an interpretation of these results and personalized tips for development. Now, the focus report also includes templates that employees can use to narrow down on their development goals and to create an actionable plan for themselves. So, overall, the LSPR can be a great resource for your organization. All right, so as Helen mentioned, we will be sending out a copy of these slides, and we'll also be posting a recording of the presentation. So we can quickly run through this summary of the solutions to these common challenges that you might experience. But again, if you want to refer to them in more depth, you can refer to the resources that we'll send out. So first, map out your organizational chart to facilitate identifying those critical roles. Next, create a system of knowledge transfer to aid your succession candidates and really to aid your general employees in your organization. Third, be strategic about when you promote internally and when you hire externally. So, external hires can be a part of your succession process. And finally, use a variety of tools to help support employee development. Now, as we're nearing the end of this webinar, I just want to emphasize that creating this structured plan is not an impossible feat for your small to medium enterprise. So hopefully I've outlined that there are definitely various key factors to consider, but the succession process is achievable and it's a worthy investment for your organization. So on that note, I'd like to hear from you. How successful is your organization at implementing strategic plans such as succession processes? So do you always follow through on these strategic plans? Perhaps you sometimes follow through. Perhaps your organization creates the plans but rarely follows through or implements them. Or do you maybe not create these plans at all? All right, thank you for your responses. So you sometimes follow through on the strategic plans. So that's really helpful to hear. So I do want to note that in fact, 67% of strategic plans often fail due to poor execution. So even when companies are able to create plans, many fall short of adequately preparing succession candidates for their next position. So, excuse me, given these stats, this is where working with one of our consultants can be really helpful. So we've guided many clients with similar challenges, and we can draw on our expertise to provide you with a streamlined process that really helps to save time and administrative efforts. We also offer accountability and objectivity to help you achieve your goals, and this can really help in keeping your employees engaged in the process. And I just want to quickly note that we can support you in different ways. So if you're only interested in a general guide with an overview of the process and a few different resources that can help to support you, I recommend that you check out our succession planning guide. Now, if you'd like more structured support, one of our very popular offerings is the succession planning launch. So this launch involves two separate half-day workshops, and it's a great option if succession planning is something that you don't have a ton of time to commit to. So we really do that heavy lifting behind the scenes, and you end up with a full succession plan by the end of it. Now, finally, if you're interested in more in-depth support, we do offer customized consulting engagements. So this can really help your business focus in on those different stages of the process and provides additional talent development consulting that's tailored for your specific organizational needs. Now, if you'd like to learn more about any of these options, please do feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to support you. Now, if this all sounds well and good, but you really don't know what your organization really needs, I'd like to point you to this free succession planning diagnostic that we've created. So this is an online survey that asks you a series of questions to better understand the state of succession at your organization. So this only takes about 5 minutes to complete, and it provides you with customized results that target the needs of your organization. And in addition to this free tool, once you've completed the survey, you'll also be able to schedule a complimentary call with one of our consultants to really go through those results and to receive practical next steps. All right, so thank you all for bearing with me, and I apologize for my cough throughout. I'm going to hand it over to Helen at this point. I think we may have a little bit of time for Q&A, Helen.
Yes, we do have a few minutes for Q&A. Thank you, Shruti, for that presentation. And anything that we don't get to in Q&A, do feel free to follow up with us via email. Our consultants are always happy to chat, so that is not a problem at all. Okay, let's start at the top here. Who should be responsible for succession planning if it shouldn't be just HR?
Yeah. So we really don't recommend creating a plan. We really don't recommend that creating that plan falls to maybe one or two people in your HR department. What we suggest is that the creation of the plan involves your core senior leadership team. So we suggest creating an advisory committee with senior leaders. So this advisory committee can work together to consider the goals of the program, the approach that they want to take, and this can also allow them to consider how they're going to communicate the succession process to the rest of the company. Now, involving, excuse me, involving leaders at this very first step really improves the organization's accountability to the process because junior employees see that senior leadership is invested in succession. So having buy-in from the top can really help in ensuring the plan is successful.
Thank you, Shruti. And I'll post in the discussion just a link to a blog that we have on how to create a succession advisory team. There's some really good tips from our consultants in there around what types of positions should be on that kind of a team and how you go about starting those meetings. Okay, I think we have time to squeeze in one more. How should I convince senior leadership to devote attention to creating a plan? This is a great question because, like you said, buy-in is very important.
Yeah, this is a really incredible question, and we do want senior leadership involved in the process, but how do you convince them if they're not convinced? So, if this has fallen on your shoulders, I would encourage you to really consider the needs and the goals of your organization. So, there is a lot of research out there showing the benefits of succession planning. So, you can really tailor this research and the impact of succession planning when you're presenting this to those senior leaders. So, if your leadership team, for example, is really focused on reducing costs, and maybe that's why they're not sure if succession planning is right for them, you can show them the long term benefits of growing talent in house. So remember, when you're doing external hiring and you're kind of reactively hiring, you're spending a lot of money and effort on recruiting employees, recruiting candidates, the actual hiring process, and even that training process. So really consider what the needs and the goals of your organization are, and then tailor um, your argument to those needs.
Great, thank you. I'll just point out also that the succession planning guide that Shruti mentioned and that I dropped in the chat a couple minutes ago is free. You can download that and start to fill that out, and that gives you something that you can also take to your leaders to say, look, we have a process, we have some ideas for what this is going to look like. We can give you some estimates around the time and the feasibility of this kind of a strategic process, and that can be very helpful for getting buy-in as well. Okay, and with the last couple of minutes, I just want to share a few announcements. One is that if you are here for a professional development credit from SHRM or ATD, particularly for SHRM, I need to send you a certificate of completion. So please send me an email. I'll post my email in the chat here as well. If you would like to get a professional development credit, just let me know. I'll send you that certificate and then you know what to do from there. And next is that if you like what you saw here, head on over to our events page on our website. I'll send the link for that as well. We are running webinars every month this year, and we have a variety of different topics, not just pertaining to succession planning, but also talent development, things like how to use the 9box tool, and other things that will be useful for you as you build your internal talent pools. So take a look at that, and if you don't see what you're looking for, then let us know. We are doing some of the planning for next year's webinar calendar. So if there are sessions that you would like to see, then we can help make that happen. And finally, we do have a feedback survey, so please take a minute to fill that out. We have a QR code for that as well. We go through all of the submissions on these feedback surveys and adjust our webinars as is requested and recommended. We take all of your feedback into account. So that would mean a lot to us. And that's all we have for you today. So thank you for taking time to be with us. Thank you also, Shruti. You're a trooper. Thanks for presenting an excellent session on succession planning for small and medium enterprises. We hope to see you at some of our future webinars. And like we said, please reach out if you have any questions via email or the contact form on our website. Hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks all.